Hello and welcome to the 20th Sunday in Ordinary Time. So glad you're here. I'm going to start by going back to last week's reflection. Remember last week, the gospel passage was Jesus telling his disciples to stay awake. I told the story of a document that came out of the Second Vatican Council, which was, when it came out, it shook the Catholic faith to the core. And it was a simple statement. Well, actually not simple, quite profound statement. It was this. It was in relation to other religions. The statement said, the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these other religions. End of quote. And it went on to say, we actually encourage people in these other religions to follow their own spiritual paths. Now that was very shocking because prior to Vatican Council II, we held this strong belief that there is no salvation outside of the church. And for the bishops at Vatican Council II, led by the Spirit of God, to say the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is holy and true in these other religions was groundbreaking. But what that did, it gave birth to a new perspective. People were now allowed to look into other religions and see what is going on, the other spiritualities, so that they can pick things that work and that can enrich their own spiritual journey. My novice master, Father Julian Black, did just that. He loved Buddhism, and so he went to the East, right? And he taught us and schooled us into meditation. He did tell us a story about the Buddha, Siddhartha, that he was sitting under the Bodhi tree when people came up to him and asked him, "Are you a god?" "Nope," he said. "Are you a wizard?" "Nope," he said. "Are you a man?" He said, "No." Then they said to him, "What are you?" He said, "I am awake." Now, fast forward to the gospel, Jesus tells his disciples that Buddha is 597 BC. Fast forward to Jesus' time, Jesus tells his disciples, stay awake. Kind of funny, isn't it? The same thing that the Buddha said, stay awake, being alert. So, but the second thing that did is not only did we have the courage to look at other religions, we can now look at our own Christian religion and look at the different denominations within our faith journey and see what they're saying. So I want to take us on a journey for this week's gospel, or this week's reading. Let us go to 1788. The Presbyterians gathered, and they arched into their governing principles these two statements. This was in 1788. And when I say this, you'll be like, what's the big deal? Because we are in 2022, right? And it just makes perfect sense. So the first principle that the Presbyterians arched into their governing principles is this: God alone is Lord of the conscience. 2, it is possible for people of the same faith to disagree on truths. Or something to that effect, the second one. Now, for us, it's like, well, what's the big deal? Well, go back and live in 1788. And at that time, if you disagreed with anything that the magisterium said, you are a heretic, going to hell. If you taught anything that the magisterium wasn't teaching, they had sticks and fire for you. Think Galileo. All he did was say, this earth is not flat as they're saying in the scriptures, that God put it on the four corners. There are no four corners of the earth. This thing is kind of round. And he says, it doesn't, the sun doesn't move around us. Galileo got put to death for teaching something that the magisterium said wasn't true. It took Pope John Paul II to say to Galileo, way after he was very dead, oops, sorry, you were right. So that is the mindset of the time in 1788. there was this very, very strong drive that uniformity was unity. This idea of diversity of thought and unity, or unity in diversity, wasn't there. You did, you believed, you said what the church said, what the magisterium said, the teaching authority of the church. Back to the first principle, God alone is Lord of the conscience. Why do you think the Presbyterians had to say that? Because in 1788, God alone was not Lord of the conscience. Your conscience was controlled by the church. And so when you find yourself at odds fighting within your conscience, do I follow this teaching of the church, or do I follow my own conscience? You follow the teaching of the church, because that represented the acceptable conscience, right? So the Presbyterians had to say, God alone is Lord of the conscience. You cannot be condemned by following your conscience. Now here's a little story for you. I'm going to try to make it brief, right? In the year 2000 or 1999, I was in East Africa, Kenya, and I was studying theology at Tangaza College over there with many, many other religious congregations. I was one of the Passionists. I was with the Passionist congregation. The nuns used to run the dispensaries, and it was a difficult time in East Africa and Southern Africa because the AIDS epidemic was spreading like wildfire. We were having funerals after funerals. Sometimes they would actually double up funerals in the church because the priest didn't have time. There were 2, 3, or 4 coffins in the church and saying one mass. It was just people. AIDS didn't only just kill people. AIDS alienated people. When you were known to have AIDS, people backed away from you. They couldn't shake your hand. My own friend became an alien in our own community because he came down with AIDS. So anyway, the sisters had these dispensaries, and they would put these brown bags, and inside the brown bags they would put in a contraceptive that is very controversial in the church. It is not sanctioned by the church. In fact, the church speaks against it. But it wasn't the big answer. It was an answer to the spreading epidemic. This will prevent the spread of HIV/AIDS. Eventually, the bishops in Southern Africa got word of this, and they saw the problem. So they sent a petition to Rome, to the Holy See, to Pope John Paul II, and asked for a special dispensation to allow this particular contraceptive in a brown bag to be given out at the churches or at these dispensaries. The Holy See answered and said they were going to study the matter. They were going to study the matter. In the meantime, people are dying like flies. What are we to do? The sisters just decided to put the brown bags on some tables outside the dispensaries so that they're not handing those things out and that people are just taking them. But it was a great moment of teaching for the seminarians and those who were walking and working with the people, those who were attending funerals, those who were feeding the orphans. What do? Do we follow the church's teaching and condemn this particular brown bag? Or do you follow your own conscience and say, in this case, I know what the church teaches, but I'm going to save some lives. Here is the bag. One of our friends got in trouble for this, because he was photographed giving a brown bag to somebody, and Father Superior called him in for a talk because you're not supposed to do that. As he was preparing to go for this talk, we gathered for a meeting, and one of the fifth years studying theology, because we call them the fifth years, they were in the last year of theology, they said, you know, there is a way out of this that will stop this conversation. When you go into Father Superior's office and he asks you about this brown bag, you just say to him, quote and unquote, it is a question of conscience. Because in Catholic theology, not even the Pope can ask you to violate your own conscience. No. The Pope is not allowed to ask you or anybody. The church cannot ask you to violate your own conscience. So when it is a question of conscience, follow your conscience. Because that's the voice of God speaking to you. Now, of course, there is a way around this for the church. They will say that your conscience is what? Misinformed. Let's go back to the readings. We found Jeremiah in 587 BC, around the same time actually that the Buddha is living, right? Jeremiah is faced with a tough job. The men of God are telling the king that this Nebuchadnezzar guy who has surrounded Jerusalem and is coming towards them to attack them, and because he has been attacking kingdom after kingdom, that he's going to be defeated. That's what the men of God are telling him. They're saying to the king, God has always protected us. He protected us against the Assyrians, against the Egyptians. These Babylonians, they will go down like flies. Don't you worry about things. God's got our back. So everybody is singing from this book. Jeremiah says, no, this is not God speaking. This is stupidity speaking. The wise thing to do here is to lay down our weapons and surrender. Let us be taken into slavery. At least we will go there alive. If we try to resist, we will be massacred. And for this, he's thrown into the cistern. And this is what I find very, very fascinating and what preaches in today's first reading. Have you ever found yourself in a place in your life when things just did not make sense, or what the authorities were saying did not match up with what was on the ground? Like there is a complete and total mismatch, and you are thinking to yourself, what in the world are they talking about? Have you been to the slums? Have you been with your people? You're out there talking theology and talking these complicated matters, and people are just left. It doesn't connect. And so this is exactly what Jeremiah is feeling, that the message of the people, of the men of God, did not match the reality on the ground. And he had the courage to speak his conscience. He goes up to the king and he says, this is not right. That is the call of the prophet. That is your call. That is my call. That is our call. Do we have the backbone sometimes to stick out like a sore thumb and preach or sing a different song when everybody else is singing one song? Many of us have done that as parents, haven't we? When everybody is letting their kids go wild, you stand up to your child and say, no, you will have discipline in this house. That is singing a very different song. But talking about all this thing of conscience, Jeremiah has to face his own conscience. Will he sing the same song that the other men of God are singing? Or will he sing the song that his conscience is asking him to sing? He remains true to that conscience, and for that he is thrown into the cistern. Maybe that is you. Maybe that is me. Imagine somebody who is divorced and they want to get married, and you're preaching to them. The church doesn't allow divorce. They've been divorced. Because in the church there is no divorce. There is an annulment. An annulment simply states that the marriage never happened. Yeah, it did happen. It was a bad one. Now what do you do with that person? Do we continue to preach that? Or do you meet that person where they are and say, I'm so sorry you went through this very unfortunate relationship, but that doesn't mean you give up on love? Do you meet them there? And sometimes you and I and everybody, maybe, we can find ourselves preaching from a very different place than what the governing body wants us to say. And that can make our lives very, very uncomfortable. Jesus in today's gospel passage says to the disciples, do you suppose that I came to bring peace on earth? No. I came to start a fire, and how I wish it was already blazing. Why? Because maybe the disciples, maybe the disciples are seeking peace at all costs. They don't want to ruffle any feathers. They don't want to say anything that will annoy anybody. And Jesus is saying, the way of discipleship is not about peace at all costs. The way of discipleship is having the courage sometimes to stand alone, to stick out. And that is the fire that is blazing. And I did talk about several months ago about the verb to pray in Aramaic is the same verb as to set a trap. So the disciples go up to Jesus and say, teach us how to set a trap, like John taught his disciples how to set a trap, because God is a wild thing that has to be caught sometimes. And when we catch God, when we catch fire, sometimes this fire is unpredictable, and it will take us to unpredictable places. When Jesus caught fire, the fire of God, this wild fire of God, took him to a place where he touched a leper. Oh God, Lord, what about you? When Jesus caught fire, that fire of God, that wild fire of God, took him to a place where he touched a corpse. Oh Lord, that made him unclean. When he caught fire, it took him to a place where criminals are hanged. Golgotha. When you catch fire, you will find yourself in places that you never thought you would ever be. Let us pray that our church may be unafraid to catch this wild fire of love, wild fire of forgiveness, wild fire of patience, wild fire of acceptance. How I wish it was blazing. How I wish it was, change the words, out of control. God out of control makes the church very uncomfortable. Somebody did say, whenever your God hates all the same people that you hate, you can be sure of this: you have created God in your own image and likeness. And I love that, because when we allow ourselves to be created in the image and likeness of God, there's going to be some flares here and there. There's going to be us standing out. There's going to be us being driven into places where we would rather not be. Catch fire. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.